BJ the Brave here, back with another WARPFORGE Fundamentals video for you. So, today we're going to talk about mulligans. The next time you lose a game, ask yourself, could you have mulliganed differently? How would a game have gone if you'd started with a different hand? What cards were in your mulligan that ended up just sitting in your hand and didn't really get used early game? What cards would you rather have had instead? The mulligan phase is the first and only time in a match where you get to take a look at your starting hand and essentially choose which cards you'd like to keep or throw back in exchange for another card that is in the deck that you designed. Many games of WARPFORGE are won and lost in the mulligan phase, and one of the differences between the better players is that they understand the deck and what to mulligan for. So in this video we're going to talk about how to mulligan effectively, why it matters, and what are some of the considerations that you might want to be thinking about during the mulligan phase. So first of all, how does it work? If you're going first, you get 3 cards and you're able to either keep all 3 or return up 1, 2 or 3 of those cards back to your deck, and you'll be then given a random card from your starting deck. If you're going second, you actually start with 4 cards, all of which can be mulliganed. So what should you be thinking about when you're trying to mulligan for an effective starting hand? The first thing is really knowing your deck. So it's good to really understand what is in your deck and how you win the game. And indeed the first thing you want to be thinking about is mulliganing for the win condition. Now not all decks need to do this, but some decks are really quite heavily based around a specific win condition. And it's almost the case that if you draw that win condition when you need it, your percentage, your odds and probability of actually winning the game increase dramatically. So for example, if we think about an Abaddon or a Chaos deck, the Sword of Drakenham is one of the win conditions. It's one of the ways, it's one of the parts of the combo that often ends up closing out the game. You've got to decide, is your deck and the matchup that you're playing against, is the win condition absolutely pivotal to your chances of winning? And if so, then you might want to consider, actually, if we don't have Drakenham in our opening hand, we might consider throwing away everything in order to maximize our chances of actually drawing the Drakenham win condition. Similar things can be said for other factions. Obviously the Tyranids have things like Ravenous Hunter, for example, etc, etc. Next up, mulliganing for a good curve. So if we think about the first turn of the game, we obviously have 2 energy. Now taking a look at this hand, we have 2 4-drops and a 10-drop. So that means that we can't play anything on the first turn with 2 energy. We can't play anything on the second turn with 3 energy. Then we could play one of these cards, and then we've also got another card here which is 10 energy, so we wouldn't be able to play for another like 5 or 6 turns. So really what we've got here is a really poor curve. So if we just accepted those 3 cards like we have here, then we would essentially have a really poor curve. What a good curve would look like would mean that we'd be able to play and make full use of our energy every turn. So we could play our 2 energy on the first turn, we could play all 3 energy of our second turn, all 4 energy on our third turn, and all 5 energy on our fourth turn. And that way we're kind of maximizing the value, and this is called this would be called a high tempo start to the game. If we'd done what we've done in this game and kept that really poor curve, real poor opening hand, we could end up falling behind in tempo as our opponent starts to build up their board, and actually we're just filled with essentially useless cards in our hand which we're not able to play. Now one thing to consider when we're playing a deck where we're looking to mulligan the curve efficiently is obviously all of the Warlord talents cost either 1 or 2 energy. So generally speaking, on the first turn you're often able to use your Warlord talent. Some Warlords are better than others for that. For example, like Galen's a really good one because it can kind of proactively develop the board from her Warlord talent. Whereas others are like Swarmlord is not as good because that kind of relies on having a board. So thinking about what your Warlord talent is, if it's something that you can play on turn 2 like Galen, then actually you might be happy having some cards in your hand that don't enable you to play something on that first turn. Therefore we'd be looking for something worth 3 energy. So in this Ultramarine version, for example, we might look for our Stern Guard in our opening hand because we could play that on the second turn. and then we might look for something like an honor guard, for example, because that means that we can play something on our third turn when we have 4 energy, and maybe even something like the impulsor. So that, if we had those 3 cards in our opening mulligan, that would be a really nice curve and a good example of mulliganing for a smooth curve. So the next consideration for the mulligan, and again this comes to understanding the matchup a little bit, is mulliganing for key removals. So generally this comes when you understand the deck that you're playing against, and you understand, for example, that they're going to play a Lich Guard on turn 5. Let's imagine we're playing against the Necrons. If we're playing Imhotep, that's one I always think about, is that Lich Guard could come down on turn 5. How can I deal with that? It becomes a real roadblock to our game plan. So what we might do is mulligan to have an answer to something that our opponent is playing. It doesn't have to be that. It could be that our opponent plays stealth units, so we might be looking for some sort of AoE, like the Scorcher Assault, for example, if we were playing Orcs. But if it was indeed the Lich Guard, then we might be looking for something like No Mucking About, which gives us that hard removal where we can automatically destroy a troop. As an Orc player, one of the considerations I often have is we have a very powerful spell called the Will of Gork, and this enables us to essentially clear the board and reset it by destroying all troops, including my own, in play. So if I'm playing against, for example, the Tyranids, or a faction where I'm particularly worried that they can build a really powerful board and it can the game can get away from you as you fall behind, then thinking actually it might be worth keeping Will of Gork or looking for Will of Gork in my opening hand, because I know that board state is coming. So mulliganing for answers to your opponent's plan is the third consideration in the mulligan phase. The next consideration is mulliganing for key cards. So what do I mean by this? They might not necessarily be your absolute win condition, but they're key cards that make the synergy of the deck that you're playing really effective. So for example, in the Orcs we might look for something like Makari. We know that my win percentage with my Orcs is going to go up dramatically, that this card synergizes with every other card in the deck. Another example that Orcs will often look for is something like the Green Horde. And so the Green Horde is a card that allows us to essentially swarm the board with troops and gain a huge tempo advantage. So again, it can be that we've built a deck that relies on key cards in order to trigger combos. Not every deck has this, and for some decks that don't have that, it's more important to mulligan for an effective curve. But some decks really do rely on those key combos. So again, understanding with the deck that you're playing, is mulliganing for the key cards essential. A big part of the key card strategy is also when you contain cards in your deck that are effective at certain times of the game. So for example, the infinite biomorphologies in Tyranids is a really powerful card if you have it in the early game. In other words, by the second turn, when you have 3 energy, if you can play this card on 3 energy, it's super powerful and it synergizes really well, and often can end up giving you a huge advantage and potentially going on to win the game. Whereas if you draw infinite biologies on, say, turn 7, the chances are you've already played a lot of the troops out of your hand, and its effect is just actually not that impactful on the game. So again, when we're thinking about mulliganing for key cards, we also have to think about those cards that we want early game, early in our hand, that are going to improve our deck and our strategy. So the mulligan phase really is one of the first tests that you have in a game. It's actually one of the most important decisions you make in every game. Sometimes people have a really good curve. For example, in this Eldar deck, you might have something like a Wind Rider, a Striking Scorpion, which is 3 energy, and a Howling Banshee, which is 4 energy. So it looks like a really good early curve, but it might be the wrong hand for that matchup. It might be, for example, in this deck, that to win the match, we're really reliant on getting our Reclaim the Stars combo off, for example. So even though we had a really good early curve, we might recognize that the importance is in that matchup isn't to have a good curve, and is to look for key cards. So it's understanding which of the previous strategies we just talked about is actually most relevant to the matchup. Similarly, part of the skill is recognizing where, for example, you might have a late game card in your early hand, but recognizing that that could be a really key card. For example, the Hemlock Wraith Fighter might be in a certain matchup really key to a removal or the way in which you're actually going to win the game. So even though it's quite a late and expensive card, we might keep it. On a similar logic, we know that legendary cards we only have one of. So when you've got a legendary card in your opening hand, what do? Do you throw that back? Because unlike other cards where we can actually have two of them, we're literally 50% less likely, right, to draw legendary cards because we only have one of them. So sometimes when we have a legendary card in our opening hand, it's worth keeping. It's worth thinking about, is it worth keeping? You know, I often think that with something like the Wailing Doom. You know, the Wailing Doom is a really powerful finisher when I'm playing the Eldari, and I'm reluctant to throw it back, and often I'll only throw it back when I recognize the importance of having that early curve and that early tempo in order to stay in the game. But if I don't need that, then often I'll keep the Wailing Doom. So, you know, when you're thinking about your mulligan phase, really consider, if you have a legendary card, whether or not it's worth keeping, because if you don't keep it, you might not get to play that card in the game. And so mulligan is really difficult because you know, you get down to this kind of like aggressive versus safe mulligan. In the example we just gave here, where we have the Wind Rider and we have the Striking Scorpion, for example, and the Banshee, it would be very safe to keep that hand, right? Because we recognise that we're going to stay in the game early. It gives us a chance to draw into our cards, so that would be a really safe decision to keep that. But a really aggressive, like I say, a really aggressive move would be to say, no, actually, it's vital that we get the Reclaim the Stars combo in this game, and so I'm actually going to hard mulligan for the Reclaim the Stars. The problem with that is that because it's such an aggressive move, it could help you to win the game that you would lose otherwise, but it could also mean that, for example, your opening hand ends up being, say, a Crimson Hunter, a Hemlock Wraith Fighter, and an Infinity Circuit or something like that. And actually what you've got there is a really poor hand to help you guide you through the early game. So understanding the payoff, how important is it that you be aggressive? Often people are too safe with their mulligan, and that's because they fail to recognise that they needed a different hand in order to win this matchup. So sometimes it's correct to be aggressive, but the risk of that, of course, is that it could turn into a disaster, because you could end up with an even worse hand than you started with in the first place. So as we've alluded to, knowing the matchup makes the mulliganing a lot easier. So the more familiar you become with the game, then the more kind of tactical you can be around it. I would say if you're a beginner, to really just think about that early curve and try to consider having a really good curve and think about some of your kind of win con cards. I think if you could start there, that will really help you to improve your matches and to improve your overall win rate. Now, one thing I will say is, you know, it's really good to consider the early part of the game. One thing that, for example, Shimatsu, who's one of the best tuning players, one of the things that he started to take into his deck of his tuning his last season was the Mucolid Spore. And so one of the things he would start to do against Ghazghkull, against the Orcs, which were the dominant meta, is he would start to mulligan fairly hard to try and get the Mucolid Spore, because he realised that this gave him a really disruptive card to Ghazghkull's very powerful early opener, because this is a flying unit that essentially does blast 2, so it can deal with the grots that would kind of spam the board early. So that's really about understanding what cards are going to help me in the early game, particularly if you're playing against an aggressive deck that you need to be able to kind of match the tempo. So in summary, when you're considering how to mulligan, think about what your win con is. Think about have you got a good curve? Have you got a decent curve that you can kind of play out a nice powerful opener? Think about key removals or key cards that are vital to the matchups. Consider those legendaries if you get them in your opening hand. Give them extra consideration to keep in, because obviously there's only one of them and you're less likely to redraw them. Try to identify whether a late game card is going to be pivotal for keeping, even though you're not going to be able to play it early on. And try to weigh up the pros and cons of having an aggressive mulligan, you know, getting rid of all three. We call it a hard mulligan if you get rid of all three cards because you're looking for something specific, like the Green Horde or Makari, for example. That's what we call a hard mulligan. So try to weigh up the pros and cons of that aggressive mulligan versus a safe mulligan. What you'll see people do sometimes is go for a half and half, where they'll keep one early game unit because it gives them something in the early curve, and then they'll kind of mulligan the rest of the cards where they're looking for something specific. But you need to practice, guys. Mulliganing is a skill and it comes with practice, but I hope some of these tips have just helped you to think about some of the key considerations when you're playing your games and when you're in that mulligan phase. If this guide's been helpful, then please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next fundamentals video.